Off the coast of Wake Island in 1944, an American submarine crew closed in on an unmarked Japanese transport ship ready to deliver a lethal blow. They had no way of knowing that there were over 1,000 U.S. prisoners of war on board. Malmedy, Belgium, 1944. In a field on the outskirts of a small town, 100 captured American soldiers assembled in a row, unaware that a German commandant had just given his men the order to open fire.
Of course, keep unauthorized.
Pyongyang, North Korea, 1952. In a taped broadcast that astonished the United States government, captured American pilots confessed that they had used biological weapons against thousands of innocent Korean civilians.
Damage me. When my son asked me what I did in Korea, how can I tell him that I came over here and dropped germ bombs on people?
Throughout the history of war, belligerents have viewed captured soldiers as a valuable resource, either as propaganda tools, diplomatic pawns, or sources of information. Captors have considered them worth more alive than dead. Military tacticians in particular have long recognized that if made to talk, POWs could shed light on the secret plans and intentions of the enemy. Military intelligence officers recognized that senior officers were often privy to more valuable information than enlisted men. And that information had to be gained in a timely manner if it was to be useful. During World War I, no one capitalized on military intelligence extracted from POWs more than the Germans. The Allies, particularly the British, were inhibited from doing so by a long-held notion that it was not proper for gentlemen to spy on one another. German intelligence agents perfected the art of interrogation, seemingly treating their POWs with respect, tricking them into a false sense of well-being. They not only eavesdropped on their prisoners, they also pioneered the use of technology to bug their conversations. An intricate game of cat and mouse had been set in motion. By the time the Second World War broke out, the Allies realized they had missed opportunities during the Great War. British intelligence established MI9, an organization dedicated to training soldiers how to resist revealing secret information and how to organize escapes if captured. In 1940, the German blitzkrieg swarmed over Europe, and over 2 million prisoners of war were taken and transferred to camps inside Germany in the occupied territories. After 50,000 British servicemen were captured at Dunkirk, MI9 shifted into high gear. Above all, MI9 taught British soldiers that it was their duty to escape. As the war progressed, it was obvious that as far as escape was concerned, the Brits were quick studies.
Their mindset was very much one of how to get away. And very complicated and complex organizations began to develop. People forging documents, people bribing guards to get hold of cameras, to take photographs to go on the forged identities, acquisition of maps. People with special engineering capabilities would therefore be the primary movers in developing tunnels.
Most POWs were not fearful of escaping because they understood they were protected by the Geneva Convention of 1929, the international agreement that sought to establish humane treatment for prisoners of war. According to these regulations, POWs who were recaptured could not receive a punishment any harsher than a month in solitary confinement. To an outsider, activity within the Allied POW camps might have seemed chaotic, but appearances were deceiving.
They were organized from the top to the bottom. Everybody belonged to something. Everybody was on some committee or was involved in escape activities or security activities, but you can't tell by looking.
Perhaps the most organized group of prisoners in World War II were the men inside Stalag Luft III, 100 miles southeast of Berlin. Throughout the war, Stalag Luft III remained the chief camp for British and American Air Force pilots. Years later, their exploits would become the subject of a movie called The Great Escape. In April of 1943, the POWs in Stalag Luft III began digging 3 tunnels, known to insiders as Tom, Dick, and Harry. In charge of escape plans was a South African named Roger Bushell. Bushell oversaw more than 600 POWs working as diggers, forgers, lookouts, and dirt haulers. Among the prisoners was Sidney Dowse, a British reconnaissance pilot shot down while on a surveillance mission over southwest France.
The idea was to get out 200 officers. We were not allowed to talk, not even mention the word tunnel, because the Germans were very smart. They were quite often, more often, one step ahead of us.
Dowse's assignment was to befriend a German guard who seemed sympathetic to the Allied cause. As work progressed, Dowse's contact warned him that the Germans were aware of their escape plans.
Every day they were always looking for tunnels. They knew we were planning a mass escape. And he begged me to tell Roger, don't make a big escape. Because if you do, the Gestapo will take over, and you've had it.
In response to multiple Allied escape attempts that tied up the energy and time of German troops, Hitler reversed the policy and issued a new directive condemning to death any prisoner who attempted escape. In spite of these warnings, on March 25, 1944, only 6 weeks before the planned invasion of Normandy, 76 men at Stalag Luft III made it through the tunnel called Harry and emerged beyond the barbed wire of the camp. Sidney Dowse was among them.
Initially, it feels that you're in seventh heaven or in love. And the fresh air was the first thing that hit. You thought, oh, the fresh air, it's so lovely. Why it should be different to what was in the camp, God alone knows, but it was the fresh air was marvelous, you see. But that only lasted for a few moments, because one realizes straight away the very serious part of your job now is to get away and not get caught.
The 76 escapees became the objects of an intense manhunt. Only 3 were able to blend into the countryside and return safely to England. The others were recaptured in less than 2 weeks.
As far as the Germans were concerned, the gloves were off. And tragically, the same attitude was exhibited after the Great Escape, when the dreadful notice was sent that escaping is no longer a sport.
The Gestapo arbitrarily chose 50 of the recaptured POWs, including Roger Bushell, and executed them. For reasons unclear to Sidney Dowse, he was spared. After being interrogated by a German officer, he was sentenced to hard labor in the Sachsenhausen concentration camp near Berlin, and remained there until the camp was liberated in 1945. A bitter lesson had been learned. As a result of the executions, the senior-ranking American officers in Stalag Luft III forbade any more escape attempts from the American compound, even those in progress. Allied POWs understood that once they went beyond the barbed wire, they risked a death sentence. But no matter how punitive the German reprisals became, nothing could compare to the atrocities experienced by POWs on the Pacific Front. In Japan, shortly after the end of World War I, a militant officer corps seized control of the country. Beginning with children in elementary school, they set out to create a culture that thought in terms of conformity and total obedience to the emperor. Bushido, the traditional samurai warrior code, became a driving force behind Japanese society. Members of the ruling military officer corps believed that it was Japan's destiny to forge a new Asian empire. The stage was set for Japanese aggression, war, and ultimately, war crimes. In 1937, Japanese troops overran Manchuria in northwest China, quickly transforming the country into a colony over which they had total control. Prisoners taken during this brutal attack became guinea pigs in a secret and grisly program known in Japan by the codename Unit 731. Using the cover of a lumber mill, the Japanese built several huge biological warfare and human research centers in Pingfan. On the outskirts of Harbin, a city near the Soviet border.
The local people were just told this was a lumber mill, and, they built a railroad spur from Harbin right into the center of the camp. Freight cars would rumble in at night, discharge people who were going to be the next group of victims. Sometimes they were brought in sealed vans, sealed trucks, so the local populace wouldn't see them.
Within Pingfan's sprawling compound, Japanese scientists experimented on POWs and civilians alike, using every conceivable pathogen from anthrax to tuberculosis to plague. Inside, doctors routinely experimented on human subjects without the aid of anesthesia. In the only known case of systematic and institutionalized military use of biological weapons by a modern state, the Japanese army bombed communities throughout China, dropping live vectors like plague-infected fleas, killing tens of thousands. It was not until the closing days of the war that U.S. military personnel discovered Japan's secret germ warfare program and the fact that human research experiments had been conducted. Anxious to keep Japan's secrets for the U.S. and out of Soviet hands, General Douglas MacArthur brokered a deal that granted full immunity from prosecution to Japanese scientists. In exchange, Japanese scientists turned their data over to the United States. Buried with the rest of the horrific episode was the testimony of a handful of American POWs who claimed that they also had been victims of biological experiments.
These ex-POWs who claimed to have been victims were largely confined to a camp in Mukden, Manchuria, known as Camp Mukden. I've interviewed a number of these people. They suffered terribly. I mean, the abuse, the mortality rate was terrible far worse than the American or any other POWs for that matter in Western Europe.
Unfortunately, the documentary evidence that might support the claims of the American survivors was either lost or destroyed. However, evidence does exist to support the stories of another group of POWs.
The most horrendous was a number of American pilots who were shot down over Japan. And they became victims of vivisection experiments in one of the most prestigious medical universities in Japan. That's documented.
After the war, a veil of silence fell over the entire episode. Unlike the war crimes trials in Europe, no Japanese scientists were ever brought to trial, and no news of the atrocities was leaked to the press. Part of the cover-up undoubtedly stemmed from the fact that the United States was using some of the Japanese data to develop its own biological warfare program. After decades of silence, the Japanese government has now been asked to assume responsibility for atrocities committed during World War II.
In remembrance lies the root of redemption, in forgetfulness, the roots of destruction. I think that's the universal truth.
Lawsuits filed in the late 1990s by both American and Chinese POWs who were subjected to terrible abuse at the hands of Japanese soldiers forced the issue out into the open.
Why should a nation get away with what they did to us in World War II? Why? I can't understand it. It's impossible to believe.
For many, the feeling is that in order for a true healing process to begin, the Japanese government should formally take responsibility for the crimes inflicted on the POWs, particularly in Asia.
That means that today, when Japanese go to these countries, they're often vilified and hated. Not for anything they did, or in many, many cases, not for anything they even know was done. But those feelings, if they're not worked through, will have an implication in the 21st century that can be quite shocking.
As the Second World War began to wind down, POWs on both sides looked forward to liberation. Some of them had no idea they would be used as pawns by nation-states vying for power in the post-war world. For some prisoners of war, the last year of World War II would become known as the killing year. On the Pacific Front in 1945, the Japanese were evacuating most of their remaining prisoners in the Philippines to Japan to prevent their liberation by American forces. These men were loaded onto unmarked Japanese vessels known as hellships for transport. In one of the great ironies of the war, thousands of POWs who had survived the brutality of Japanese captivity were killed by the torpedoes and bombs of attacking Allied forces. On the Eastern Front, propaganda generated on both sides helped to flare the emotions of a civilian populace already pushed to its limit. No European war had ever so disturbed the lives and caused the deaths of so many civilians. POWs held in foreign lands were frequent targets of civilian vigilante groups. The frenzied mood grew into a phenomenon known to military men as escalating war psychosis. In effect, the soldiers who captured POWs had to protect their prisoners against the rage of the local population. After D-Day, the tide of the war turned against German forces in France. After a summer and fall of intense fighting, the Germans employed some of their Waffen-SS forces seasoned on the Eastern Front in a counterattack in Belgium. That winter proved to be one of the coldest on record. In December of 1944, the SS Panzers attacked in force. They smashed the frozen Americans and took more than 22,000 prisoners in the Battle of the Bulge. In the midst of the battle, a small group of American infantrymen suffered one of the worst atrocities experienced during combat with Germany in World War II. The episode was to become known as the Malmedy Incident for the town in Belgium where it took place.
A fairly small group of Americans were captured by one of the SS units, a mobile unit led by Colonel Born Joachim Peiper. He was known in the SS as Blowtorch because he burned everything.
Approximately 100 U.S. soldiers were ordered to line up in tight formation and wait for vehicles to take them to the rear. Then a junior SS officer ordered a nearby tank to open fire on the prisoners. A few of the Americans managed to break and run. The rest were killed.
So there was a field full of dead guys who were executed, who didn't fall as soldiers, but who were illegally executed. This was absolutely murder. There was no other way to describe this. I mean, they had surrendered in good faith to these SS troopers and expected to be treated as prisoners of war.
After the war, American officials went to incredible lengths to find the perpetrators of the massacre, and they finally brought Jochen Peiper to trial in Nuremberg. As the commanding officer of the SS troops, he was found guilty and sentenced to death by hanging. But a court later ruled that his trial had not been fair. His sentence was commuted to a short stay in prison.
Now, keep in mind he was known as Blowtorch. And he went to France and worked quietly in France as a translator for the rest of his life. But curiously enough, his house burned down one night with him in it.
After Peiper's death in 1976, no one was ever charged. Many historians agree that the Malmedy massacre may have given the Americans their first taste of what a war without mercy was all about. By the winter and spring of 1945, most captured Allied soldiers believed that World War II was about to end. Listening to handmade radios, they had heard the latest war news from the BBC. As the Russians advanced on the Eastern Front toward the heart of the Reich, the German army was forced to evacuate many prison camps and march the POWs westward. Some Americans were liberated by the Red Army. These POWs soon discovered that rather than being returned to their own lines, only a few miles away, they were to be sent east to Odessa for eventual return to the United States by ship. What these soldiers did not know was that the politics of the Cold War were already heating up. Allies were turning into enemies, and many POWs were caught in the crossfire. They were soon to realize that the Soviet Union had little regard for POWs, whether they be Americans or even Russians.
Stalin felt that his soldiers should die rather than be taken prisoner. And he treated them accordingly after the war. Some of them went to Siberia. So the accident of birth is enormous, and where you get captured and by whom, of course, is very important.
Stalin wanted his Soviet citizens back. he also wanted the 41,000 anti-communists who'd turned against the Red Army to fight alongside the Germans. He had no compunction about using American POWs as the bargaining chip to force their repatriation. At the Alta Conference, the fate of these Russian defectors was sealed when the Allied powers acceded to his demand to return all Allied POWs to the country of their origin. While this settlement caused the release of most American soldiers being held by the Russians, the fate of many others is unknown to this day. In the post-war Soviet Union, the prison system was full of millions of German soldiers, but Stalin had no intention of promptly returning these men to their homeland.
The Russians saw prisonerness as free labor. All I had to do was feed them and keep them warm, and you got all the free labor you wanted.
Stalin exacted his final revenge by detaining these German POWs for years. Over 5 million Germans were interned in Russia and were called upon to rebuild universities, hospitals, and even the Moscow underground. Many did not return home to Germany until as late as 1954. When they did return, they faced yet another ordeal, one common to all POWs.
The aftermath for prisoners is the least known story of all, because we think repatriation is a wonderful time, and we assume that was the end of it, because they're liberated or repatriated, they're back with their families and loved ones. But the experience never leaves them.
Only time can heal the wounds of the prison experience. As the POWs of World War II began to reflect on their experience and to lament abuses inflicted by their captors, another conflict was brewing. Within 5 short years, the Korean War would expose American POWs to a new form of systematic torture that would become known as brainwashing. In the years immediately following World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union found themselves locked in what many perceived to be a struggle for world domination. In 1950, when communist troops from North Korea invaded South Korea, United Nations troops were deployed there. What began as a police action on the Korean peninsula soon flared into all-out war. UN soldiers who were captured expected that the international laws regulating the treatment of POWs would be obeyed. The vast majority were shocked when their North Korean captors discarded the Geneva Convention as if it had never existed. Early in the war, many American and UN POWs were paraded through North Korean towns and displayed as criminals in front of the local populace. They were forced to march barefoot, sometimes up to 250 miles in sub-zero weather. Almost immediately, frostbite became a major problem. Any soldier unable to continue marching because of exhaustion, frostbite, or wounds received in battle was executed on the spot. U.S. government officials got their first clue that abuse was rampant from air reconnaissance reports.
In many cases, long lines of prisoners could be seen from the air, but there was nothing the Americans could do about it. The Americans were pretty much outnumbered.
By 1951, the United Nations War Crimes Division knew that the North Koreans had committed several secret massacres of both South Koreans and Americans. One of the most infamous was the incident on Hill 303. In August of 1950, the North Koreans surprised and captured 46 Americans. After their capture, the soldiers were stripped of their combat boots and their hands were tied behind their backs. A few days later, the men were led to a nearby ravine and executed. In this massacre, like the Suncheon Tunnel massacre committed 2 months later in North Korea, a few men managed to survive by hiding under the bodies of their fallen comrades. Then, in November of 1950, General Douglas MacArthur masterminded a daring counteroffensive. In an amphibious landing in the Incheon Peninsula, U.S. troops circled behind the North Korean army and cut off their supply lines, rolling the North Koreans all the way back to the Yalu River on the border of China. Victory seemed certain.
They thought they were going to go home by Christmas. They were having their Thanksgiving chow out in the field. They were putting their guns in the box. They thought that was done. They thought they won it. And then here is the entire Chinese army looking at them. Oh my God, who are you?
The Chinese launched a massive counterattack, pouring 30 divisions across the Yalu River. Suddenly, the American forces were in full retreat in the midst of one of the coldest winters in Korean history. Once the Chinese army entered the war, the captivity experience in Korea became a different matter altogether.
It was part of our containment policy to stop the communists. And the communists were in a battle with us for world dominion, without question. And that meant they were trying to win the hearts and minds of a great many people. And so they didn't want to be seen as barbarians, mistreating prisoners and so forth.
The leader of the Chinese communists recognized that American POWs could be valuable tools in an ideological war.
Mao Zedong had become the first Chinese warlord in history to realize that people could be more useful to you alive than dead.
Rather than kill or abuse their captives, the Chinese organized them into small cadres for political re-education. The Chinese were skillful interrogators, intent on completing their mission of thought reform. It was in response to this process that the term brainwashing entered the American lexicon for the first time. American civilians who'd been raised with fundamental beliefs in freedom of thought were shocked.
The Chinese did attempt to divide their prisoners in terms of political thinking, whereas nobody else had ever done that before, to Americans. This was political re-education of a major proportion.
The Chinese called those prisoners who were willing to question the validity of the United Nations cause in Korea, or the social system in the United States, progressives. Those who resisted the re-education program were referred to as reactionaries and singled out for torture. Some reactionaries developed unique coping skills to escape the notice of their captors.
There was a term of playing it cool. Don't bring the ire of and the attention and the anger of your captors right on you. Don't get that attention.
Among the 9,000 or so UN POWs was a small group of captured pilots. For this group of prisoners, the Chinese had a completely different program in mind. The pilots were to be used in a massive propaganda campaign designed to turn Third World popular opinion against the United States. Chinese officials convened the world press and alleged that the Americans had been dropping biological weapons on both North Korea and Manchuria, spreading disease over tens of thousands of civilians.
This was an exemplar of the cruelty and inhumanity of the capitalist West, that on helpless civilian populations they would drop evil bacteriological weapons There were films of bomb fragments with flies crawling around on them and so on, which were supposed to represent this.
The accusations were nearly impossible to prove or disprove, but the North Koreans hoped that the confessions of the pilots would convince people that Americans were guilty of engaging in biological warfare.
The germ bombs were loaded 15 minutes before our mission, while ordinarily our aircraft were loaded 2 hours or more before a mission.
There were the testimonies, filmed or taped or written out and signed by American flyers whose military duties had taken them over enemy land and who'd been shot down and captured, who now said, yes, we were involved in germ warfare. We admit it.
56 American flyers not only confessed that they'd dropped germ bombs, but also apologized for having done so.
Though I'm not married yet, I intend to be. When my son asked me what I did in Korea, how can I tell him that I came over here and dropped germ bombs on people, destroying them, bringing death and destruction? How can I go back and face my family in a civilized world? How can I tell them these things, that I am a criminal in the eyes of humanity?
That the United States was arranging back to us.
At first, the confessions made by these pilots seemed so authentic that even some U.S. officials believed them and joined the world community in condemning the immorality of this action. And so began one of the great mysteries of the Korean War. People from every corner of the globe debated whether or not the United States had actually engaged in biological warfare. It would take years for the truth to emerge. Only after the pilots returned to the United States did experts gain some insight into the ultra-secret program that had been developed by the Chinese to obtain their false confessions. In little over 3 years of warfare spanning the entire length and width of the Korean Peninsula, over 7,000 American servicemen were captured, of whom at least 2,700 were known to have died in captivity. Before hostilities ended in 1953, Operation Little Switch exchanged North Korean and Chinese POWs for 684 UN prisoners, including 149 Americans, many of whom were sick or wounded. What soon came to light was that included among this group of sick and wounded were a number of healthy progressives who had cooperated with the enemy, enjoyed a captivity of relative ease, and won an early release. For those who remained in the prison camps for another 5 months, the early release of their countrymen, whom many considered to be traitors, was galling. After the armistice in 1953, Operation Big Switch completed the POW exchange between former combatants. A total of nearly 89,000 POWs changed hands. Along the way, some United Nations POWs were loaded into cattle cars without any food and transported to Kisong, where they sat for days, waiting for vehicles to take them to Freedom Village. 21 American POWs had so assimilated into the communist culture that they elected to remain in China. The popular Western press made much of their defection. The media made it seem as though American fighting men in Korea were weak. Some critics suggested they were the products of a decadent culture. Books and films of the period explored the reasons why American GIs had gone soft, even blaming their mothers for the way they'd been raised.
And the idea here was that the Americans did not behave in captivity as they should have. They're not like those hardcore guys in the Philippines or in the Kauai Railway. They were just weak, overfed, pampered bunch of babies who were crybabies.
Even before they reached the shores of the United States, returning POWs were subjected to harsh scrutiny.
Where it got really weird was after the final release. These guys didn't get on planes, they went home by boat. And the Army put intelligence personnel aboard these ships, oh yes, to debrief every single prisoner. And I have to tell you that some of the debriefings were not friendly. They were actively seeking individuals who were overtly disloyal.
What the POWs did not know was that there was increasing evidence across the country that communist spies were indeed active. It was in this atmosphere that some of the American pilots revealed that they'd been forced to confess dropping so-called germ bombs under extreme duress.
North of Gwangju.
One of those attempting to unravel the mystery of why so many officers had made such false admissions was Dr. Lewis Jolyon West, then a psychiatrist in the U.S. Air Force Medical Corps.
Well, the Air Force had a great need to know, not only because now these Americans who had performed these acts were coming back and something had to be decided about what to do with them, but also how to train others who would perhaps find themselves in similar situations in the future to behave in a more desirable way.
Air Force officials asked Dr. West to help them modify their training program for flight crews who might fall into the hands of an enemy. At first, Dr. West and his colleagues surmised that a drug, perhaps something like a truth serum, could have been used to alter the pilot's behavior. After extensive investigation, they decided that if the Chinese were using any drug at all, it was most likely a stimulant, probably an amphetamine. But drugs were not the primary means by which the Chinese had influenced the pilots. What West and his colleagues discovered from their interviews with POWs was that the Chinese had used an old and very effective technique to debilitate their captives.
No fresh air, no exercise. Alternately, I was starved and fed. I went through extended periods, one 12-day period and one 7-day period of not being allowed to sleep at all. After this 20 weeks of this solitary and torture and bullying business, I would say that I was mentally active about like a 10 or 11-year-old child.
The Chinese, like the Russians before them, had found that if you keep people awake long enough, deprive them of sleep long enough, they will enter into a state of some kind of confusion in which they become more suggestible and oftentimes will confess to things that we know they didn't do.
Tests were performed to try to reproduce the effects of sleep deprivation. The issue generated so much attention that in 1959, a New York disc jockey named Peter Tripp orchestrated a publicity stunt to capitalize on it. In a famous experiment that was nationally broadcast, Tripp deliberately kept himself awake for over 200 hours as he sat in a glassed-in Army recording booth in the middle of Times Square. His actions were monitored by Dr. West, by then a professor at the University of Oklahoma, and his colleagues. From the Tripp experiment and others like it, it appeared that if people were deprived of sleep for an extended period of time, they began to demonstrate many symptoms of severe mental illness, including brain wave changes, delusions, and hallucinations. Once in this state, they could be quite easily deceived, manipulated, and influenced.
Sleep deprivation and constant interrogation, usually by teams of people, but with one principal coming back again and again. And in the fullness of time, you usually find out what you want to know.
West also found that the POWs had been broken down, not through systematic torture, but by making them highly dependent upon their captors.
The dependency on captors is something of enormous importance. It's clear as crystal if you just study the case material that an isolated prisoner or captive who is constantly being interrogated by seemingly objective and sincere and even decent interrogators becomes dependent upon them. And it isn't so hard to understand this dependence. If your life, your comfort, and maybe even the well-being of your loved ones back home, who knows what, is totally in the power of other people, and you're helpless in their hands.
Between sleep deprivation and the process of creating a strong dependency on their interrogators, it seemed that the Chinese had been able to achieve the results they wanted. Under these circumstances, the commission investigating the behavior of the Air Force pilots wondered what kind of disciplinary action was appropriate.
My recommendation to the Air Force, and that of the people to whom I reported them, was that these men should certainly not be punished or court-martialed for what they had done, that it was out of their control. If there was blame to be attached, to attach it to the captors and the ones who had put them through this situation.
Dr. West believed that it was impossible to accurately predict how any person would behave without having experienced the same conditions. After the American experience in North Korea, the military community knew that the Geneva Convention was a useless document if POWs were captured and held by non-signatory countries. In 1954, during the administration of President Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Joint Chiefs of Staff drafted a code of conduct for members of the armed forces. According to the code, a prisoner, when questioned, was to evade answering questions to the utmost of his ability. He was not to make any oral or written statements that were disloyal to his country.
Our code of conduct changed shortly after the Korean War, when we had this idea that somehow our boys had not acted with the same discipline during the Korean War as they had in World War II or World War I.
Although people at the time saw the code as a fix for some of the problems that had surfaced in Korea, many historians today believe that this attitude did a great disservice to the memory of the POW experience in Korea.
I wanted to make absolutely clear that the history is solid. These guys resisted a hostile captor to the very best of their ability.
By setting standards that were simple and understandable to everybody, the armed services attempted to regulate how POWs behaved during captivity. The hope was that once POWs had a set of common ideals to work towards, they could share the risks of captivity more equitably. During World War II in Europe, POWs pitted themselves against their captors, extending the battlefield into the prison compound. In the fight against Japan and again against Korea, POWs watched all the protections of the Geneva Convention fall by the wayside when their captors did not play by the same rules. A generation later, when Americans were incarcerated in North Vietnam, the abuse of POWs continued. Prisoners were subjected to interminable bouts of solitary confinement and torture. When these men tried to live up to the standards of the Code of Conduct, they found it lacked flexibility. However, they worked to forge a solid community, and together they found the strength to mount a secret war against their captors.